Chapter 16. Before their late breakfast was over at the Cross Triangle Ranch, Helen Manning came across the valley meadows to help with the work of the household. Jimmy brought her, but when she saw that she was really needed and that Miss Baldwin would be glad for her help, she told Jimmy that she would stay for the day. Someone from the Cross Triangle, the dean said, would take her home when she was ready to go. The afternoon was nearly gone when Curly returned from the lower end of the valley with a woman who would relieve Miss Baldwin of the housework, and as her presence was no longer needed, Helen told the dean that she would return to the Reed home. "I'll just tell Patches to take you over in the buckboard," said the dean. "It was mighty kind of you to give us a hand today. It sure's been a big help to Stella and Kitty."
"Don't bother with the buckboard, Mr. Baldwin. I would much enjoy the walk, but I'd be glad if Mr. Patches would go with me. I would rather feel safer, you know," she smiled.
Miss Baldwin was sleeping and Kitty was watching beside Phil, so the dean himself went so far as the wash with Helen and Patches as the two set out for their walk across the meadows. When Helen had said goodbye to the dean with a promise to come again on the morrow, he had turned back towards the house. She said to her companion,
"Oh, Larry, I'm so glad for this opportunity. I wanted to see you alone, and I couldn't think of how to manage it. I have to tell you something, Larry, something that I must tell you, and you must promise to be very patient with me."
"You know what happened this morning, do you?" he asked gravely, for he thought from her words that she had, perhaps, chanced to hear of some further action to be taken by the suspicious cattleman.
"It was terrible, Larry. Why didn't you tell them who you were? Or why did you let them?"
She couldn't finish. He laughed shortly. "It would have been a sinful waste of words. Can't you imagine me trying to make those men believe such a fairy tale under such circumstances?" For a little they walked in silence, then he asked, "Is it about Jim Reed's suspicion that you wanted to see me, Helen?"
"No, Larry, it's about Kitty," she answered.
"Oh."
"Kitty told me all about it today," Helen continued. "The poor child's beside herself."
The man did not speak. Helen looked up at him almost as a mother might have done.
"Do you love her very much, Larry? Tell me truly, do you?"
Patches could not, dare not look at her.
"Tell me, Larry," she insisted gently. "I must know. Do you love Kitty as a man ought to love his wife?"
The man answered in a voice that was low and shaking with emotion. "Why should you ask me such a question? You know the answer. What right have you to force me to tell you what you already know, that I love you, another man's wife?" Helen's face was white. In her anxiety for Kitty, she had not foreseen the situation in which, by her question, she had placed herself.
"Larry!"
she said sharply. "Well," he retorted passionately, "you insisted that I tell you the truth."
"I insisted that you tell me the truth about Kitty," she returned.
"Well, you have it," he answered quickly.
"Larry," she cried, how could you ask a woman you do not love to be your wife? How could you do it, Larry? And just when I was so proud of you, so glad that you found yourself, that you were such a splendid man."
"Kitty and I are the best of friends," he answered in a dull, spiritless tone. "The best of companions. In the past year I've grown quite fond of her. We have much in common. I can give her the life she desires, the life that she's fit for. I'll make her happy. I'll be true to her. I'll be everything to her that a man should be to his wife."
"No, Larry," she said gently,
touched by the hopelessness in his voice, for he had spoken as though he already knew that his attempt to justify his engagement to Kitty was in vain.
"No, Larry, You cannot be to Kitty everything that a man should be to his wife. You cannot, without love, be a husband to her."
Again, they walked in silence for a while, and then Helen asked,
"And are you sure, Larry, that Kitty cares for you as a woman ought to care?"
"I could not have asked her to be my wife if I hadn't thought so," he answered with more spirit.
"Of course,"
returned his companion gently.
"And Kitty could not have answered yes if she did not believe that you loved her."
"Do you mean that you think Kitty does not care for me, Helen?"
"I know that she loves Phil Acton, Larry. I saw it in her face when we first learned that he was hurt, and today the poor girl confessed it. She loved him all the time, Larry, has loved him ever since they were boy and girl together. She's tried to deny her heart, she's tried to put other things above her love, but she knows now that she can't. It's fortunate for you both that she realized her love for Mr. Acton before she spoiled not only her own life, but yours as well."
"But how could she promise to be my wife when she loved Phil?" he demanded.
"But how could you ask her when you—"
Helen retorted quickly without thinking of herself. Then she continued bravely, putting herself aside in her effort to make him understand.
"You tempted her, Larry. You did not mean it so, but perhaps you did. You tempted her with your wealth, with all that you could give her of material luxuries and ease and refinement. You tempted her to substitute those things for love. I know, Larry. I know because I see you. I see you, dear man, and I was tempted too once."
He made a gesture of protest, but she went on.
"You did not know, but I can tell you now that nothing but the memory of my dear father's teaching saved me from that terrible mistake. You're a man now, Larry. You are more to me than any man in the world, save one. And more than any man in the world, save that one, that I respect and admire you for the manhood that you've gained. But, Larry, don't you see? When a man's a man, there's one thing above all that he cannot do. He cannot take advantage of a woman's weakness. He cannot tempt her beyond her strength. He must be strong both for himself and for her. He must save her always from herself."
The man lifted his head and looked away towards Granite Mountain. As once before, this woman had aroused him to assert his manhood's strength. She called now to all that was finest and truest in the depth of his being. "You're always right, Helen," he said, almost reverently.
"No, Larry," she answered quickly, "but you know that I'm right on this."
"I'll free Kitty from her promise at once," he said as though to end the matter. Helen answered quickly,
"But that's exactly what you mustn't do."
The man was bewildered. "Why, I thought... What in the world do you mean?" She laughed happily as she said,
"Stupid Larry, don't you understand? You must make Kitty send you about your business. You have to save her self-respect. Can't you see how ashamed and humiliated she'd be if she imagined for a moment that you didn't love her? Think what she would suffer if she knew that you were merely trying to buy her with your wealth and the things that you possess."
She disregarded his protest.
"That's exactly what your proposal meant, Larry. A girl like Kitty, if she knew the truth of what she had done, might even fancy herself unworthy to accept her happiness now that it's come. You must make her dismiss you and all that you could give her. You must make her proud and happy to give herself to the man that she loves."
"But what can I do?" he asked in desperation.
"I don't know, Larry, but you must manage somehow. For Kitty's sake you must."
"If only the dean hadn't interrupted the proceedings this morning, sure would have simplified everything," he mused, and she saw that, as always, he was laughing at himself.
"Larry, please don't,"
she cried earnestly. He looked at her curiously. "Would you have me lie to her, Helen? Deliberately lie? She answered quietly.
I don't think that I would raise that question if I were you, Larry, considering all the circumstances.
On his way back to the Cross Triangle, Patches walked as a man who, having determined upon a difficult and distasteful task, is of a mind to undertake without delay. After supper that evening, he managed to speak to Kitty when no one was near. "I got to see you alone for a few minutes tonight," he asked Hurley. "As soon as possible. I'll be under the trees near the bank of the wash. Come to me as soon as it's dark and you can slip away." The young woman wondered at his manner. He was so hurried and appeared so nervous and unlike himself.
"But Patches,
"You must." He interrupted with a quick look towards the Dean who was approaching them. "I've something to tell you. Something I have to tell you tonight." He turned to speak to the Dean, and Kitty presently left them. An hour later, when the night had come, she found him waiting, as he had said. "Listen, Kitty," he said abruptly, and she thought from his manner and the tone of his voice that he was in a state of nervous fear. "I must go. I dare not stay here another day. I'm going tonight."
"Why, Patches," she said, forcing herself to speak quietly in order to calm him. "What's the matter?"
"Matter?" he returned. "You know what they tried to do to me this morning?" Kitty was shocked. It was true that she could not care for this man as she loved Phil, but she had thought of him as her dearest friend, and she respected him and admired him. It was not good to find him now like this, shaken and afraid. She couldn't understand. For the moment, her own troubles was put aside by her honest concern for him.
"But Patches, it's all gone now. It can't happen again."
"You don't know. Or you wouldn't feel so sure. Phil might—" He checked himself as if he feared to finish the sentence. Kitty thought there must be some more cause for his manner than she'd guessed.
"But you're not a cattle thief," she protested. "You have only to explain who you are, and no one would for a moment believe that Lawrence Knight could be guilty of stealing. It's ridiculous on the face of it."
"You don't understand," he returned desperately. "There's more in this than stealing."
Kitty started. "You don't mean Patches, you can't mean Phil," she gasped.
"Yes, I mean Phil. We were quarreling and I was angry. Girl, don't you see why I must go? I dare not stay. Listen, Kitty, it'll be all right. Once I'm out of this country and living under my own name, I'll be safe. Later, you can come to me. You can come. You will come, won't you, dear? You know how I want you. This doesn't need to change our plans. If you love me, you'll—" She stopped him with a low cry.
"And it was you who did that?"
"But I tell you, we was quarreling, Kitty," he protested weakly.
"And you think that I could go to you now?"
She was trembling with indignation.
"But you're so mistaken. It seems that I was mistaken too. I never dreamed that you could ever make me forget what you told me. You are right to go."
"You mean you won't come with me?" he faltered.
"Could you really think that I would?" she retorted.
"But, Kitty, you'll let me go? You won't betray me. You'd give me a chance."
"It's the only thing I can do," she answered coldly. "I should die of shame if ever it was known that I had thought of being more to you than I have been, but you must go tonight."
And with this she left him, fairly running towards the house. Alone in the darkness, Honorable Patches smiled mockingly to himself. When morning came, there was great excitement on the Cross Triangle Ranch. Patches was missing. And more, the best horse in the Dean's outfit, the big bay with a blazed face, had also disappeared. Quickly the news spread throughout the valley and to the distant ranches. And many were the wise heads that nodded understandingly, and many were the "I told you so's" The man who had appeared among them so mysteriously and who, for a year, had never been a failing topic of conversation, had finally established his character beyond any question. But the cattlemen felt with reason, because of the Dean's vigorous defence of the man when they would have administered justice, that the matter was now in his own hands. They offered their services and much advice. They quietly joked about the price of horses, but the Dean laughed at their jokes and listened to their advice, and said that he thought the sheriff of Yaqui County could be trusted to handle the case. To Helen, only Kitty told of her last interview with Patches, and Helen, shocked and surprised at the thoroughness of which the man had brought about Kitty's freedom and peace of mind, bade the girl forget and be happy. When the crisis had passed and Phil was out of danger, Kitty returned to her home, but every day she and Helen drove across the meadow to see how the patient was progressing. Then, one day, Helen said goodbye to her Williamson Valley friends and went with Stanford to the home that he had prepared for her. And after that, Kitty spent much more of her time at the house across the wash from the old Acton homestead. It was during those weeks of Phil's recovery, while he was slowly regaining his full measure of health and strength, that Kitty learned to know the cowboy in a way that she'd never permitted herself to let himself be known. Little by little, as they sat together under the walnut trees, or walked slowly about the place, the young woman came to understand the mind of the man. As Phil, slyly at first, and then more freely, opened the doors of his inner self and talked to her as though he was talking to Patches of the books that he had read, of his observations and thoughts of nature, and of the great world movements and activities that by magazines and books and papers had brought to his hand, she learned to her surprise that even as he lived amid the scenes that called for the highest type of physical strength and courage, he lived an intellectual life that was as marked for its strength and manly vigor. But, while they came thus daily into a more intimate and closer companionship, they spoke to no one of their love. Kitty, knowing how her father would look upon her engagement to the cowboy, put off the announcement from time to time, and not wishing their happy companionship be marred during those days of Phil's recovery. When he was strong enough to ride again, Kitty would come at midnight, and together they would roam about the ranch and the country nearby. So it happened that Sunday afternoon, Mr. and Mrs. Reed with the 3 boys were making a neighborly call on the Baldwins, and Phil and Kitty were riding in the vicinity of the spot where Kitty had first met Patches. They were seated in the shade of a cedar on the ridge not far from the drift fence gate when Phil saw 3 horsemen approaching from the further side of the fence. By the time the horsemen had reached the gate, Phil knew them to be Yaqui Joe, Nick Cambert, and Honorable Patches. Kitty, too, had by this time recognized the riders, and with an exclamation started to rise to her feet. But Phil said quietly, "Wait, Kitty. There's something about that outfit that looks mighty queer to me." The men were riding in single file, with Yaqui Joe in the lead and Patches last, and their positions were not changed when they halted, while Joe, without dismounting, unlatched the gate. They came through the opening, still in the same order, and as they halted again, while Patches closed the gate, Phil saw what it was that caused them to move with such apparent lack of freedom in their relative positions, and why Nick Cambert's attitude in the saddle was so stiff and unnatural. Nick's hands were secured behind his back. His feet were tied under the horse from stirrup to stirrup, while his horse was controlled by a lead rope, one end of which was made fast to Yaqui Joe's saddle horn. Patches caught sight of the 2 under the tree as he came through the gate, but he gave no sign that he noticed them. As the little procession moved slowly nearer, Phil and Kitty looked at each other without word, but as they turned again to watch the approaching horseman, Kitty impulsively grabbed Phil's arm. And so, sitting in such a unconscious intimacy, They must have made a pleasing picture. At least the man who rode behind Nick Cambert seemed to think so, for he was trying to smile. When the riders were almost within speaking distance of the pair under the tree, they stopped, and the watchers saw Joe turn his face towards Patches for a moment, and then look in their direction. Nick Cambert did not raise his head. Patches came on towards them alone. As they saw that it was the man's purpose to speak to them, Phil and Kitty rose and stood waiting, Kitty with her hand still on her companion's arm. And now, as they were given a closer and less obstructive view of the man who had been their friend, Kitty and Phil again exchanged wondering glances. This was not the Honourable Patches whom they had known so intimately. The man's clothing was soiled with dirt and old from rough usage, with here and there a ragged tear. His tall form drooped with weariness, and his unshaven face, dark and deeply tanned, and grimmed with sweat and dirt, was thin and drawn and old, and his tired eyes, deep set and dark hollows, were bloodshot as though from many sleepless nights. His dry lips parted in a painful smile as he dismounted stiffly and limped courteously forward to greet them. "I know that I'm scarcely presentable," he said in a voice that was as worn and old as his face, "but I could not resist the temptation to say howdy. Perhaps I should introduce myself, though," he added, as if trying to save them from embarrassment. "My name is Lawrence Knight. I'm a deputy sheriff of this county." A slight movement as he spoke threw back his unbuttoned jumper, and they saw the badge of his office. "In my official capacity, I'm taking a prisoner to Prescott." Phil recovered first and caught the officer's hand in a grip that told more than words. Kitty nearly betrayed her secret when she gasped,
"But you said that you—"
With his ready skill, he saved her. "That my name was Patches? I know it was wrong to deceive you as I did, but I regret that it was necessary for me to lie so deliberately, but the situation seemed to demand it, and I hope that when you understood, you'd forgive the part I was forced to play for the good of everyone interested." Kitty understood the meaning in his words that was unknown to Phil, and her eyes expressed the gratitude that she wasn't able to speak. "By the way," Patches continued, "I'm not mistaken in offering my congratulations and best wishes, am I?" They laughed happily. "We've made no announcement yet," Phil answered, "but you seem to know everything." "I feel like saying from the bottom of my heart, God bless you, my children. You make me feel strangely old," he returned with a touch of his old wistfulness, and then, adding in his droll way, "Perhaps, though, it's from living in the open and sleeping in my clothes for so long. Talk about horses, I'd give my kingdom for a bath, a shave, and a clean shirt. I'd begun to think that our old friend Nick never would brand another calf, that he had reformed just to get even with me, you know. By the way, Phil, you'll be interested to know that Nick's the man who's really responsible for your happiness." "How?" demanded Phil. "Why, it was Nick who fired the shot that brought Kitty to her senses. My partner there, Yawkby Joe, saw him do it. If you people would like to thank my prisoner, I'll permit it." When they decided that they would deny themselves that pleasure, Patches went on, "I can't say I blame you. He's surly, all right, and ill-tempered. Which reminds me that I must be about my official business and land him in Prescott tonight. I'm going to stop at the ranch and ask the dean for the team and buckboard, though," he added as he climbed painfully into the saddle. "Adios, my children. Don't be staying out too late." Hand in hand, they watched him rejoin his companions and ride away behind the Tallyholt men. The dean and Miss Baldwin, with their friends from the neighboring ranch, were enjoying their Sunday afternoon together as old friends will, when the 3 Reed boys and little Billy came running from the corral where they had been holding an amateur donkey riding contest with a calf for the wild and wicked outlaw. As they ran together, the group under the walnut trees, the lads disturbed the peaceful conversation of their elders with wild shouts that "Patches is back! Patches has come back! Nick Cambert's with him, and so is Yokpai Joe!" Jim Reed sprang to his feet, but the Dean calmly kept his seat and glanced up at his big friend with a twinkling eye and said to the boys with pretended gruffness, "Oh, what's the matter with you kids? Don't you know that horse thief Patches wouldn't dare show himself in Williamson Valley again? You must be having bad dreams. That's what's the matter with you, or else you're just trying to scare us, aren't you?"
"Honest, it's Patches, Uncle Will. We seed him coming from beyond the corral," said Jimmy. "I seen him first," shouted Connie. "I was up in the grandstand. On the fence." "Me too," chirped out Jack.
Jim Reed stood looking towards the corral. "The boys are right, Will," he said in a low tone. "There they come now." As the 3 horsemen rode into the yard, and the watchers noted the peculiarity of their companionship, Jim Reed muttered something under his breath. But the Dean, as he rode leisurely to his feet, was smiling broadly. The little procession halted when the horses evidenced their dislike of the automobile, and Patches came swiftly forward on foot. Lifting his battered hat courteously to the company, he said to the Dean, "I've returned your horse, sir. I'm very much obliged to you. I think you'll find him in fairly good condition." Jim repeated whatever it was he had muttered to himself. The Dean chuckled. "Jim," he said to the big cattleman, "I want to introduce my friend, Mr. Lawrence Knight, one of the Sheriff Gordon deputies. Looks like he's been busy over in the Tally Holt Mountain neighborhood." The 2 men shook hands silently. Miss Reed greeted the officer cordially, and while Miss Baldwin, to the Dean's great delight, demonstrated her welcome in the good old-fashioned mother way.
"Will, Baldwin, I could shake you," she cried as Patches stood, a little confused by her impulsive greeting. "Here you knew all this time, and you kept pestering me by trying to make me believe that you thought he had run away and become a thief."
It was perhaps the proudest moment of the Dean's life when he admitted that Patches had confided in him that morning when they were so late to breakfast, and how he understood the man's disappearance and the pretense of stealing a horse that could only bend a blind. The good Dean never dreamed that there was so much more in Honorable Patch's strategy than he knew. "Mr. Baldwin," said Patches presently, "could you let me have a team and a buckboard? I want to get my prisoners to Prescott tonight." He laughed shortly. "And, well, I certainly would appreciate some cushions." "Sure, son. You can have the whole cross triangle outfit if you want it," answered the Dean, "but hold on a minute." He turned with a twinkling eye to his neighbor. "Here's Jim with a perfectly good automobile that don't seem to be busy." The big man replied, "Why, of course. I'll be glad to take you in." "Thank you," returned Patches. "I'll be ready in just about a minute."
"But you're going to have something to eat first," cried Mrs. Baldwin. "I bet you're half starved. You sure look it."
Patches shook his head. "Oh, don't be tempting me, Mother. I can't stop now."
"But you'll be coming home tonight, won't you?"
she asked anxiously. "I'd like to," he said. "And can I bring a friend?"
"Your friends are our friends, son," she answered.
"Of course he's coming back," said the Dean. "Where else would he go? I'd like to know." They watched him as he went to his prisoner and, unlocked the handcuffs that held Nick's right wrist, he relocked it to his own left arm, thus linking his prisoner securely to himself. Then he spoke to Joe, and the young man dismounted, unfastened the rope that bound Nick's feet. When Nick was on the ground, the three came towards the machine. "I'm afraid I must ask you to let someone take care of the horses," called Patches to the Dean. "I'll look after them," the Dean replied. "Don't forget now that you're coming back tonight. Jim will bring you." Jim Reed, as the three men reached the automobiles, said to Patches, "Will you take both of your prisoners in the back seat with you, or shall I take one of them in the front with me?" Patches looked at the big man straight in the eyes, and they heard him answer with significant emphasis as he placed his free hand upon Yokpai Joe's shoulder. "I only have one prisoner, Mr. Reed. This man is my friend. He will take whatever seat he prefers." Joe climbed into the rear seat with the officer and his prisoner. It was after dark when Mr. Reed returned to the ranch with Patches and Joe.
"You'll find your rooms all ready, son," said Miss Baldwin, "and there's plenty of hot water in the bathroom tank for you both. Joe can take the extra bed in Curly's room. You can show him. I'll have your supper as soon as you're both ready."
Patches almost fell asleep at the table. As soon as they had finished, he went to his bed, where he remained, as Phil reported in intervals during the next forenoon, dead to the world until dinner time. In the afternoon they gathered under the walnut trees, the Cross Triangle household and the friends from the neighborhood ranch, and Patches told them his story. How when he left the ranch that night, he had ridden straight to his old friend Stanford Manning, and how Stanford had gone with him to the sheriff, where, through Manning's influence, together with the letter which Patches had brought from the dean, he had been made an officer of the law. As he told them briefly of his days and nights alone, they needed no minute details to understand what it meant to him. "It wasn't the work of catching Nick in a way to ensure his conviction that I minded," he said, "but the trouble was that while I was watching Nick day and night and dodging him all the time, I was afraid some enthusiastic cowpuncher would run upon me and treat himself to a shot just for luck. Not that I would have minded that so much either after the first week," he added in his drawl way. "But considering all the circumstances, it would have been a rather sort of a poor finish." "What about this Yokpai Joe?" asked Phil. Patches smiled. "Where's Joe? What's he been doing all day?" The dean answered, "He's just been moseying around. I tried to get him to talk, but all he would say was that he'd rather let Mr. Knight tell it." "Billy," said Patches, "will you find Yokpai Joe and tell him that I'd like to see him here?" When little Billy, with the assistance of Jimmy, Connie, and Jack, had gone proudly on their mission, Patches said to the others, "Technically, of course, Joe is my prisoner until after the trial, but please don't let him feel it. He will be the principal witness for the estate." When Joe appeared, embarrassed and ashamed in their presence, Patches said, as courteously as he would have introduced an equal, "Joe, I want my friends to know your real name. There's no better place in the world than right here to start that job of man-making that we have been talking about. You remember that I told you how I started here?" Yokpai Joe lifted his head and stood straighter by his tall friend's side, and there was a new note in his voice as he answered, "Whatever you say goes, Mr. Knight." Patches smiled. "Friends, this here is Mr. Joseph Parkhill, the only son of the distinguished Professor Parkhill, who you all know quite well." If Patches had planned to enjoy the surprise his words caused, he would not have been disappointed. Presently, when Joe had slipped away again, Patches told him how, because of his interest in the young man, and because of the lad's strange knowledge of Professor Parkhill, he had written east of the distinguished scholar's history. The professor himself was not really so much to blame, said Patches. It seems that he was born to an intellectual life, and the poor fellow just never stood a chance. Even as a child, he was exhibited as a prodigy, a shining example of the possibilities of the race. His father, who was also a professor of some sort, died when he was a baby. His mother, unfortunately, possessed an income sufficient to make it unnecessary that Everett Charles should ever do a day's real work. At the age of 20, he was graduated from college. At the age of 21, he was married to, or perhaps it should be more accurately to say, he was married by, his landlady's daughter. Quite likely the woman was ambitious to break into the higher life to which the professor aspired, and caught her cultured opportunity in an unguarded moment. The details aren't quite clear, but when their only child Joe was 6 years old, the mother ran away with a carpenter who had been at work on the house for some 6 weeks. A maiden aunt of some 50 years, who was a worshipper of the professor's cult, came to keep his house and train Joe in a way that good boys should go. But it seemed that the lad proved too great a burden, and when he was 13 they sent him to a school out here in the west for the benefit of the climate. The boy, it was said, being abnormally mentality, needed to pursue his studies under the most favorable of physical conditions. The professor, unhampered by his offspring, continued to climb his aesthetics ladder. The boy, in due time, escaped from school and was educated by the man Dryden and Nick Cambert. "And what will become of him now?" asked the dean. Patches smiled. "Well, the lad is 21 now, and we have agreed it's about time that he began to make a man of himself. I can help him a little, perhaps. I've been trying occasionally the past year, but you see the conditions haven't been altogether favorable for that experiment. It might be a bit easier from now on." During the time that intervened between the trial of the Tallyholt mountain man, Phil and Patches re-established that intimate friendship of those first months of their work together. Then came the evening when Phil went across the meadow to ask Jim Reed for his daughter. The big cattleman looked at his young neighbor with a frowning disapproval. "It won't do, Phil," he said at last. "I'm Kitty's father, and it's up to me to look out for her interests. You know how I've educated her for something better than this life. She may think now that she's willing to throw it all away, but I know better. The time would come when she'd be miserable. It's got to be something more than a common cow-puncher for Kitty. Phil, that's the truth." The cowboy did not argue. "Do I understand that your only objection is based upon the business in which I'm engaged?" he asked coolly. Jim laughed. "The business in which you're engaged? Why, boy, you sound like a First National Bank. If you had any business of your own, if you was the owner of an outfit and could give Kitty the things her education taught her to need, it'd be different. I know you're a fine man, all right, but you're only a poor cow-puncher just the same. I'm speaking for your own good, Phil, as well as Kitty's," he added with an effort of kindliness. "So then if I had a good business, it'd be different?" "Yes, son, it would make all the difference in the world." "Thank you," said the cowboy quietly, as he handed Mr. Reed a very large, legal-looking envelope. "I happen to be half owner of this ranch and outfit. With my own property, makes a fairly good start for a man of my age. My partner, Mr. Lawrence Knight, leaves the active management wholly in my hands, and he has abundant capital to increase our holdings and enlarge our operation just as fast as we can handle the business. The big man looked from papers to the lad and back to the papers. Then a broad smile lit upon his heavy face as he said, "All right, I give up. You win. You young fellers are too swift for me. I've been wanting to retire anyway." He raised his voice and called, "Kitty! Oh, Kitty!" The girl appeared in the doorway. "Come and get him," said Reed. "I guess he's yours." Helen Manning was sitting on the front porch of that little cottage on the mountainside when she and Stanford began their years of home building. A half-mile below, she could see the mining buildings that were grouped about the shaft in a picturesque disorder. Above, the tree-clad ridge rose above the sky. It was too far from the great worlds of cities, some would have said, but Helen, she didn't find it so. With her books and her music and the great out-of-doors, and with the companionship of her mate and the dreams they dreamed together, her woman heart was never lonely. She lowered the book that she was reading and looked through the open window to the clock in the living room. A little while, and she'd go down the hill to Stanford, for they loved to walk home together. And then, before lifting the painted page again, she looked over the wide view of rugged mountainsides and towering peaks that every day held for her some new beauty. She'd resumed her reading when the sound of horses' feet attracted her attention. Patches and Joe were riding up the hill. They stopped at the gate, and while Joe held stranger's bridle reins, Patches came to Helen as she stood on the porch waiting to receive him.
"Surely you'll stay for the night?"
she urged when they had exchanged greetings and had talked for a little while. "No," he answered quietly. "I just came this way to say goodbye. I stopped for a few minutes with Stan at the office. He said I'd find you here."
"But where are you going?"
she asked. Smiling, he waved his hand towards the mountain ridge above. "Just above the skyline, Helen."
"But Larry, will you come again? You won't let us lose you altogether?"
"Perhaps, some day," he said.
"And who's that with you?"
"Just a friend who cares to go with me. Stan can tell you about him."
"Larry, Larry, what a man you have become!" she cried proudly as he stood before her holding out his hand.
"If you think so, Helen, I am glad," he answered, and then turned away. So she watched him go. Sitting there at home, she watched him ride up the winding road. Now he was in full view on some rocky shoulder of the mountain. Now some turn carried him behind a rocky point. Again she glimpsed him through the trees. Again he was lost to her in the shadows. At last, for a moment, he stood out boldly against the wide, arced sky, and then he passed from sight, over the skyline, just as he said. The end. Well, everybody, we have reached the end of the story. Kind of sad to run out of pages. Kind of wanted to see what Patches ends up doing. Kind of was hoping he'd find a woman or something there, but I guess that's the point of a good story. It makes you care. Anyways, thank you everyone who's been loyally listening and watching and thumbsing upsings and commenting and all that fancy dancy stuff. It's been great seeing all the interaction. Anyways, we'll sign off here quickly and get into another one. probably go to a Pat Stevens Western written by Peter Fields. Anyways, thank you for all your support. Good night for now, ladies and gentlemen, and we will see you on the next one. Bye for now.